This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, I talked to a novelist, Todd Shimoda, author most recently of Oh, A Mystery of Monono ware. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Todd Shimoda is the author of novels he's called somewhat experimental, post-modernish, dealing with Asian or Asian American themes, but also broad questions of existence, or philosophical mysteries. These include 365 Views of Mount Fuji, The Fourth Treasure, and most recently, Oh, A Mystery of Monono ware. Todd, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Colin. Great to be here.
These three novels of yours, I just rattled off the names, they do form a kind of loose trilogy, and the obvious way I can tie them together is to say all of them take place, in full or in part, in Japan. But in your own mind, what holds these books together?
I guess there's a kind of a playoff between a certain Japanese art form and a modern-day technology or science. So let's see, my first book, 365 Views of Mount Fuji, there was the idea of the woodblock print artist as kind of a mad scientist in the world of robotics. And so there was kind of a playoff between those two arts and technology. And The Fourth Treasure was about a shodo or calligraphy master in Japan, and he has a stroke. So the science in this case is neuroscience. And kind of looking at the idea of what makes us a human being from a scientific point of view as well as from an artistic point of view. And let's see, the art form is, Monono ware is a Japanese poetic term, so it deals with really more of the traditional Japanese style poetry and literature. And the science or technology in this case is social networking. Specifically the use in Japan by suicide clubs that people that come together to discuss suicide.
This particular interaction of art and technology you have go on in your novels, is this something now you think about when you look back at your books and say, hey, that's what I did? Or was that what you wanted to do going into each of them?
A little bit of both. I would say that it kind of mirrors my own life. My background is in my other than writing, my background is in engineering, and also educational technology, where I studied cognitive science. So I've kind of had both sides of artistic form as well as science form. So there's always been in my own mind kind of a dichotomy or some kind of conflict going on between the two sides of me that want to control my own life in some way. So at this point, the writing side is winning, but the other side always is the side that makes a little more money. So there's always a kind of a trade-off between the two. But the older I get, the more I'm willing to sacrifice any financial comfort for just getting the writing done. So I'm moving toward that direction, but I still have one foot in kind of technology and science kind of things. But for my obsession or my passion with life, it's definitely writing. And so I tend to. I don't really write autobiographical things at all, but I think that's probably the most autobiographical part of my writing is this idea of art versus science, or even kind of modernity versus more classical kind of life.
Now, you say the word versus between all those. Do you think that it does count as what we would understand as a conflict, or is it something more complex than that?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's definitely more complex than that. I would say that there's a lot of similarities in the way that those two things come together and in the way a writer works or an artist works as well as a scientist works. So I think that there's kind of, you think of a scientist kind of really logical, but on the other hand, scientists can be more just as intuitive and kind of reaching into the subconscious to solve problems as well as the writer can. So I think there's actually a lot more to it than just, what everyone off the street would think of as this laid-back writing or artistic kind of life versus the hardcore thinking, logical scientist life. So there's definitely there's definitely a lot more overlap than just the verses kind of thing would imply.
How has your thinking about these issues evolved over the course of these three novels? Because in 365 Views of Mount Fuji, there do seem to be characters that, when you first start reading it, there seem to be characters who stand for certain things. You know, there's one character who's very much into robotics, and she thinks almost in the terms of a robot. And there's characters who are very artistic and who are to the other end of the spectrum extremely, it seems like, when you started out. But it does seem, as you go through your books, that the elements of the characters intermingle to an extent that nobody seems to necessarily represent any mode of thought. Does this make any sense, first of all, to you, what I've said so far about these readings of your books?
Yeah, it does. I think the characters may start out as one or two-dimensional kind of characters that are involved in some aspect of life. For example, the main character in The Fourth Treasure, who's the daughter of the calligraphy student, she's in graduate school studying neuroscience and tends to be really kind of rigid about that. And she writes a journal and she writes about the neurochemicals that she's learned about that day. And as she goes along and discovers her own real life and how it's tied into this idea of calligraphy as an art form, she really starts to go towards the other side of her life, the more I would guess intuitive, more subjective, and more I would say subconscious even, where things are really emotionally deep down inside of her and come out. So yeah, I think that there is this kind of idea of character development through starting out in one extreme and moving and trying to understand the other side of life. So there's always this kind of going back and forth, and it really is a good way for a writer to work, I think, because it really develops this natural sort of conflict that it really helps a story narrative work in a real natural way. It's not really it doesn't seem like it's a forced kind of, a lot of some books you read, and it's kind of a forced conflict between two
Yes.
characters that are put together that really would not even want to, be together at all, and they would just, they could just leave if they really wanted to. But this is more of an internal kind of conflict. I think that works more naturally.
Now, the art component of the story of the latest book O, it's of course Monono or ware, and a concept that I think has been, now this it's the funniest part, because here in America, kind of moving in circles of enthusiasts of Japanese culture, of Japanese film, of Japanese literature, that term gets thrown around so much that one comes to believe that it is a widely known thing in Japan as well. But you have your character Zach Hara, a Japanese American, go to seek out Monono ware. He's in Japan doing that, and he finds that in Japan, this is a term that's kind of a bit musty and that is consigned mostly to the realms of rarefied literary criticism. And now, is that the case? Is that what any of us would find if we went over looking for this?
To my understanding, that's true. I talked to a lot of people, a lot of Japanese people about it when I was doing research on the concept, and most Japanese, when I actually posed the question, they wouldn't, like in an email, so they wouldn't even answer me back. It would just be this, all of a sudden this vacuum would open up, and everything would get swallowed up, and I wouldn't hear from them again. So, and the people that would actually talk to me about it might have heard about it, but didn't really understand what it was about. The Japanese people that did know about it had obviously some training in or studies in advanced kind of Japanese literature, poetry, but for the most part, it's not a term that's used in everyday language. So yeah, it's kind of dropped off the radar in Japan, and I think you consciously have to go search for it and study it. But on the other hand, I think the feeling of a ware, at least, maybe not the more technical Monono ware term. The term of ware is still kind of felt in Japan. It's kind of devolved, I guess, from this original idea of a pure emotional response to something, and it's really kind of become it moved more towards sadness, and now it's even more like wretched. So it's just really this more negative feeling rather than this really poetic feeling of the original ware that was in Genji or the Myriad of Lee poems. So it's kind of changed, and I think it's got a really kind of a negative feel towards it now. So in my book, I tried to kind of revive it as a more naturalistic feeling, and how we react to our emotional life and how we express that. So, and any kind of emotion can be a beautiful experience, even the sad one. So that's what I was trying to do with the term, is trying to revive it back into its more of its original form.
It does seem to get defined, such as it can be defined, in English language literature about, a specific Japanese novel or a specific Japanese filmmaker or what have you, as a feeling of sort of bittersweet sadness at the transience of things. And you can kind of tell, even if you don't know much about it, that it's being decomplicated for you. It seems like it's a concept that there are so many nuances to it that you could kind of go down into the rabbit hole as far as you want and never hit bottom. Is that correct?
Oh, that's totally correct. And that's originally, I was trying to write a nonfiction monograph about the concept for a publisher. So it was kind of a half memoir and half literary criticism kind of thing, or literary theory, trying to understand the concept. And I just couldn't really explain it well, and I was having so much trouble with it. I was wondering if I had my own problems with my emotional life. So that's kind of where the whole idea for the book came about originally. And as you read the book, I've actually put in some of the nonfiction stuff that I originally wrote about it, as kind of like the main character was writing about it as he was doing research on it. And yeah, it just kind of goes round and round, like you said, in the rabbit hole. It just keeps going down and round, and you don't really know where you're going to come out, or if you're even going to find something there at the end. And I think that's what makes the ending so much more powerful, is that finally there's some kind of resolution to this idea of Zach's own emotional crisis. And I think that one of my friends who read the book said it best. He said, I was reading the book, I really liked the story, but this Monono thing was just confusing me. And the more I read about it, the more I thought I understood it at first, and then you said something else, and I said, no, that's not really what it is. But at the end, when when the ending occurred, then it just came to me. It just came to me. Oh, I understand. So doing it in a fictional format actually helps. At least it helped me try to come to terms with what the deep meaning of the term is.
Yes, it is. Of course, the subtitle is A Mystery of Monono ware, and it is a mystery novel, and in the beginning, middle, end sense, and there's some formal overlap with the mystery genre as well. And now, having that ending there, having an ending or other moments to illustrate for this protagonist, Zach Hara, to illustrate Monono ware for him, is that then the main advantage you get over making a novel out of this idea, rather than making a book that's a factual nonfiction first-person account of, Todd Shimoda goes in search of Monono ware, and here's what happened to him?
Yeah, I think that's the main advantage of that. I obviously, I don't want to give away anything about the ending, but he does encounter the Japanese suicide clubs, and of course, that's something that becomes a real powerful thing in the book. And of course, I personally would not want to get that close to a Japanese suicide club.
Yes, he gets very close indeed.
Yeah, right. So there's that advantage in the fictional format. And when I was writing the book in my own memoirs, I realized that my own life is pretty boring. As far as any great emotional traumas and things, I've had a pretty easy emotional life, I discovered when I was writing it. There's been little things that I think were real powerful to me that really helped me write my books. But for the most part, I've personally been pretty mellow as far as any tragedies or any great accomplishments, I think. So for me to write about Monono ware, it was a little bit difficult. I could write about real subtle things, but I think I needed some big punchy kind of epiphany about emotions, and then the novel form really allowed that to happen.
Now, what could you use from your own life? Of course, the only obvious thing that somebody would be able to see is that Zach Hara also happens to be a third generation Japanese American. Was that it as far as what you could take from your own life, and you could give that to Zach, and then you had to make up everything else, or were you able to use other elements of? Maybe you say it's been boring, but surely there's plenty you can pull.
Yeah, I did use some other things in my life for Zach Hara's story. He's an English teacher. So was I in Japan. His grandfather immigrated from Japan, and so did mine. So that was a big aspect of my life, trying to understand, my grandfather getting on a boat when he was 16 or 15 and coming over here, by himself. And let's see, my grandfather had the truck. I think it was a GMC truck instead of the Chevy truck in the book. Chevy sounded a little more sexy than GMC, so. And plus, GMC was bankrupt at the time. So,
yes.
So it became a Chevy truck. So there was a lot of emotional attachments to my grandfather. Zach commits some petty crimes. I have to admit, when I was in Japan, I probably committed a petty crime or two, but I'm not going to say what that is. So, and I think when I travel, I find myself having more Monono ware moments, mainly because you're in a different environment and you're kind of out of your comfort zone, and so you really, at least for me, I really feel more of my what kind of person I really am when I'm actually pushed to experience something foreign or new. So I think that having Zach go to Japan was one reason that I did that, is because when I was in Japan, having never been there before, and a third generation, you're pretty much all American. I knew a little bit about Japanese culture, but not very much. So when I went there, it was fairly foreign to me too. So, but being Japanese American, I could really start to see some of the Japanese side of me come through. So there was that kind of understanding of my own roots, and so Zach kind of goes through the same thing. So yeah, there was a lot more to it other than just his being Japanese American. But as far as the overall, the main story theme about his emotional epiphany and things like that, that was purely fictional. But I could see it happening. I mean, I could see myself being pushed to more extremes and really finding out more about myself, but I'm not sure I really want to go to that level.
In a lot of the Asian American literature that I've read, or just simply Asian American stories, especially focusing on, say, a third generation Asian American, you do see a lot of this pattern where you have, of course, the generation that came over to America. You have this generation being focused on, let's say it's the third one. Then you have the ones in the middle who are less interested, perhaps, in the country of their heritage, but then it's the couple generations down, the ones that, as you said, are pretty much all American, that then pick it up again and kind of go back in search of it. Was that the same for you? Were you at the end of a chain that had kind of not forgotten about Japan, but had gotten kind of less interested in it through the years?
Yeah, I think so. I think my father, and when he was growing up in Colorado and growing up in through World War II, and it seems like there was kind of a push to kind of push down the Japanese side and really focus on becoming an American citizen. And so he didn't speak much Japanese, and I didn't learn anything from him in Japanese wise. But so yeah, and it just seemed like I was at a school with maybe two other Japanese Americans, so it was very limited contact and very limited cultural upbringing. I go see my grandparents, and they'd serve all Japanese food and speak Japanese, and we go to the Buddhist temple sometimes, and but other than when I went home, it was all back to pretty much white bread in America at the time. So I was interested in literature, but I read all European and American, European American type of literature, and I think I first read a Japanese author. I think I read some Yukio Mishima, and it's like, whoa, this is so different from the European fiction I've been reading. So then I got interested in Japanese literature, and then particularly Kobo Abe is one of my all-time favorites, and so I really kind of started reading the fiction, and really kind of realizing there's this whole cultural side of Japan that I knew nothing about, from my superficial kind of upbringing and Japanese food and that kind of thing, but a whole different Japanese psyche almost. So then I really wanted to go to Japan and just kind of experience Japan. And of course, reading Kobo Abe and Yukio Mishima, you get kind of a real skewed view of the other side of Japan. But I really kind of searched out both sides, the real traditional cultural Japan as well as more the underground kind of rough side of Japan, and kind of found both. I really got inspired to do my own fiction kind of based on the Japanese authors. So.
It is true in Mishima there is that sort of elaborate worship of tradition, and then in slash despair. And in Kobo Abe there is the part of Japan no one ever seems to talk about outside of Japan, and maybe inside Japan as well. And then those authors then influenced the way you explored or saw Japan when you finally got to go there.
Oh yeah, definitely. I lived in a real funky little apartment, and it was near a railroad track, and I found these funky little underground kind of bars that I would go into and meet some really rough characters. I felt like I could be in a Kobo Abe book, it was so great. I just absolutely loved it, and got into a little trouble a couple of times, but nothing serious, and I could fit in pretty well. People thought I was Japanese at first. Of course, when I started talking, my limited Japanese, there was all sorts of surprise and what's going on with this guy. But then that kind of helped me open some doors. I would be treated a little bit differently because they knew I wasn't, I was more American than Japanese. So there was that kind of uniqueness factor about me that actually made me some friends with these kind of rough characters. So I did experience that, and for me that was more real than going to a tea ceremony or a lot of the more traditional art kind of things. But I experienced both. But I really got more down and dirty. I think that really helped my writing more.
Of course, all the Westerners I talk to who go to Japan have the same story about how if they can speak Japanese, they go there and they speak it, and it's always the surprise from the Japanese themselves saying, "Oh, you can actually speak? No, you can't actually speak it." But you had a bit of the reverse then, where they thought, "Wait a minute, you learn Japanese after another language, and that confused them?"
Oh yeah, right, and it just my limited Japanese. They thought I could speak it fluently. Just by a few words I could say with a good accent. And I was really not very fluent at all, and I'm still not. So yeah, but there was a lot of this. You could really kind of communicate without a lot of words there. There was a lot of there was just like this gut kind of language for some reason that you could really get into. The more you drink, the easier it is.
Now, this gritty urban Japan where a lot of this drinking can go on, the Japan that Kobo Abe wrote about, and this Japan that you saw when you were there in the 80s, how come it's been, it's also the Japan, I should add, that Zach Hara goes to as well, and in much of your book. How does this come to be a Japan that is, so interesting? Maybe that's something that only Kobo Abe readers like you and I would say, but I mean, it is interesting. How has it become a Japan that is not really talked about much in literature or focused on much in even modern depictions of Japan in narrative?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there are authors that really do that well, and other authors that just want to stay away from it at all and focus more on the classical look of Japan. I think a lot of Japanese people would not want you to experience, the kind of the street, urban grittiness kind of Japan. They want Japan to have this really nice kind of image. So I think it depends on the author's predilections. What he's really or she is interested in, as well as their experiences in Japan. So I would say that it depends on the author's real desires of what they want to express. So. I think there is also a general Japan that most people want Japan to have a good image. I think it's the traditional kind of face that they want to show the world. So it may be difficult for most most people that go there to, when they meet, your average Japanese person, to, have them go and take you down into the, to the real wilds of the urban kind of Japan. So.
Yes, this Abe in Japan, I'll call it for the purposes of this discussion, is something that a reader of his books will recognize in O, and they'll also recognize certain formal things and certain qualities of the layout. Of course, if people haven't seen this book, it's filled with illustrations by your wife, and it's got full pages of art. I'm flipping through it right now. The thing that as a Kobo Abe reader most struck me first was the little iconographic illustrations before each chapter. Was that deliberate as an homage, or did that just happen to be something you liked and something that's in his books as well?
You mentioned my wife. Yeah, that's the other thing that ties these three books together, is that my wife's an artist, and she studied classical Japanese calligraphy, but she's more of an abstract artist, so she really took the classical Japanese training and really went to an artistic, abstract form with it. So in each book, there's a different style of art that ties the stories together. So that's another way that these three books are tied together. She did the main art first, kind of the more, I guess it's more like sumie paintings with their kind of photographs and drawings on rice paper, and then they're done with a wash, and then she adds brush strokes to them. It's kind of the idea of this subjective mono-noir experience, and I personally said those are great, and to tie the story together, I said, well, Zach's kind of an amateur artist, so he's probably going to do some sketches that would really kind of go with the chapters. So it was kind of my suggestion to her that she do these little iconic sketches, one per chapter, is kind of tying the story together. And yeah, I was definitely thinking of Kobo Abe, whose books there's always some weird kind of artistic form and little sketches that go along with the story. So yeah, everything I do pretty much has something to do with Kobo Abe in some way, even if it's something that I consciously think about or subconsciously comes through. So when you mentioned that, I thought, oh yeah, you're right. That definitely was a Kobo Abe-esque kind of thing. So.
And what's especially interesting is in the actual narrative of the book, it's told in the first person by this character, Zach Hara, this Japanese American we've been talking about, in search of Monono ware. And this is a guy who doesn't have much of an emotional life. He's a little worried at times in the book that he doesn't experience emotions like other people, and he thinks he certainly hasn't experienced something as complex as Monono ware that leads him to these suicide groups. But what I found really interesting with the bit of the Kobo Abe connection as well is that that's never something that he wrote his characters as having, like an emotional deficiency. But at the same time, anybody who reads his books thinks they do. They have that kind of prose to them. And what I want to ask is not so much about Abe, but about creating a character with emotional troubles or sort of a flatness of emotions that a reader can still engage with. How did you frame this challenge in your mind? How did you go about it?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think that originally when I was trying to come to grips with Monono ware, I realized that I was not fully understanding the concept. So there was that initial spark of, what's a person to the most extreme emotional deficiency that I could think of? How would they understand Monono ware? What would they have to do? So that kind of is the initial narrative spark for the story. And then, of course, I was thinking also of Camus and, the stranger and how his own emotional flatness kind of led him into all sorts of trouble. So there was also that kind of inspiration, I think, for this character. And I think it really helps. I think any ending of a book, the best endings are really something that really emotionally punches the reader in the gut, so to speak. I really wanted a huge kind of emotional experience at the end, and so it slowly builds up. But the ending is really kind of almost comes out of nowhere, I think, in some ways. So it really lends power to the ending, the emotional experience of the ending. So I think Camus and also my own experience with trying to write about emotions really, that's kind of how I came up with the idea. And the story was actually fairly easy for me to write, and I'm not sure why that is, to write about somebody without emotions. It turned out to be, I think I wrote it in 4 months, so it's a fairly, it's the first draft anyway. So it seemed to work pretty well. The character worked well, and the character, Zach, really took over the writing at some point, so it started to, come really fairly easily as far as writing goes. Sometimes I can struggle mightily trying to get something down, but this went pretty smoothly.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Todd Shimoda, novelist, author most recently of A Mystery of Monono. You can find our complete interview archive on our website, colinmarshallradio.com. And if you like this conversation you're hearing, do check out, for example, my conversation with Ian Baruma, scholar, novelist, observer of Japan and Asia at large, or my conversation with Kim Hendrickson from the Criterion Collection, talking about Japanese filmmaker Shohei Imamura. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Todd Shimoda. You describe, as I quoted you in the very beginning of the interview, about you describe yourself as being a bit of an experimental storyteller, or you're writing in an experimental way, telling your stories experimentally. And the way we're talking about it now, it makes sound not. It doesn't make it sound conventional, but if you hold up your books, if you hold up your books all together and you look through them, I just finished reading the trilogy, so the comparison is on my mind. It appears to be, in some sense, less experimental than, say, a book like 365 Views of Mount Fuji, whose pages are all laid out in this very unconventional way with sidebars and illustrations in all sorts of places. And this, of course, the book, it looks like an art book. Obviously, it's got a lot of illustrations. It's got pages dedicated to art, as I said. It's got factual components to it. Do you see this book as being equally experimental, or more so, or less so, or where does it stand in terms of the techniques you use and how unconventional you get? Is this a new high point in that, or is it a different route than the others?
I would say that it is more of a straightforward story than the other two. 365 Views, I originally wrote in hypertext format, and that's why it seems to be scattered all over the place with the story. So there was a lot of hypertext, is how you write, like web pages. You can click here and go to this storyline or to this page. And so it was kind of that idea of going back and forth. Originally it was in a CD. I wrote it in a CD for a CD book kind of thing, but didn't ever get published. So we had to turn it into a paper book. So that I think that's really why that seems so much more experimental, is because it started out as a hypertext clickable link story that we turned into a paper and ink story. So it was quite that was definitely an experiment. The Fourth Treasure was maybe one step back from that. It has several different varied narrative elements in it, from journals to chemical formulas to interludes to back in historical times. So there was a lot of different storylines going on. So I think that was more experimental than O. And O is actually, I would say it's more of a straightforward story. I think the experimental thing here is more just trying to create a book about some obscure Japanese poetic term called Monono ware, which the book could have just been too obscure, or it just could have been fallen flat and really not worked at all. So I think the experimental part is that, rather than more of the. There's a little bit of nonfiction in it and art, of course, but the story, the storyline is pretty. It's a pretty straightforward kind of narrative structure. So it's definitely less experimental that way.
Right, and that's why I say it's the book itself, taken as a whole, could be either the most experimental one you've done or the least, depending upon how you frame it, because it's
right.
At its core, there is that the whole premise is more experimental than the other books have been. But I also wanted to get an idea, back up a little bit, as far as the nonfiction monograph you began about Monono ware, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I've read that was you had to talk to a lot of people about their experiences with this concept, and you had to, or you chose to, I should say, research various disciplines' point of view on that. Was that what the basic MO was for when you first started out researching this subject?
It wasn't the entire thing. I did a lot of research in libraries. It was kind of even before the web, so you had to actually go to a library, and I did some work with some research librarians, and I found some fairly obscure references. Like one was a PhD dissertation by somebody who wrote about ware, and there were a couple other books that had been translated. So there wasn't a whole lot of English work on Monono ware, which is all I could really handle reading. So there was a difficulty in finding anything that was really good about it. I did talk to a professor particularly in Japan and asked him what his concept of Monono ware was, and he goes, well, it's difficult. In Japan, everything, difficult is kind of a common word there, trying to explain something. So he said, but let me look into it. And he actually did some surveys with some of his students and found out that most of his students who were, younger, hadn't even heard of the term. But they did have an idea of the feeling of a ware anyway, kind of this feeling of desolation. And then at the time, the Japanese economy was so bad that I think that they could relate that to the economy. And prime ministers were coming and going like once every few months. So there was really a desolate feeling in Japan. So I think the ware feeling was there. But as far as the poetic term, it wasn't so well known. And I talked to a few friends that I knew from Japan, and I didn't really get much. So it was difficult to find out any information. And then I just said, well, I got some stuff, but I need to add some more. So I started writing my own personal Monono ware moments, where I would actually describe an experience that really hit me as something that I remember well, and something that caused me to either want to write a poem or write a book about the idea as kind of a kernel for a story idea. And my own kind of I traveled around the world, and so there were a lot of that came through that because of traveling. But even then, looking around my own neighborhood, I found certain things like this old gnarly tree that was in the middle of a parking lot. They didn't cut the tree down, but they kind of boxed it in this really tight wood structure, and it was just kind of just hanging on in this parking lot, and it would really flower beautifully in the spring, and it was just I just felt this tree really had this idea of Monono ware around it. So, little things like that I wrote about, but trying to incorporate all of that into a little bit I found out about it. I'm not really a poet, so I think that was kind of hindering me in some ways. That I couldn't really express that more in a poetic kind of way. So I'm definitely more of a novelist. So that's kind of how I eventually came around to having to write about it in fictional form, was through a novel.
Even aside from the complexities of something like Monono ware, in Western eyes, Japan seems like a place that is both very exciting, but also in many senses just strangely unreasonably sad. You mentioned the whole economic issues and the political problems that are there, but if news stories come across to the English-speaking world about the hikikomori, the kids who wall themselves up in their rooms and never come out, decide to give up on life. In your book, of course, there's the suicide clubs who, it seems unfathomable to an American that people would get together in a group and all want to commit suicide together just because they, have lost. It's a really literal loss of the will to live that's hard to conceive in the West, at least that I have found. What do you think is going on there, as far as a place that is so advanced and a place that has so many things going for it, at least it seems like, also has these pockets of utter despair that goes to an extreme that people don't necessarily think about outside of there?
Yeah, that was a kind of a topic that I did a little bit of research on when I was writing and trying to look into it. It's really a very deeply complex issue. I don't know. I have a grasp on it enough to really say some really in-depth things about it. But I would say that as far as suicide goes, there's always been the traditional kind of Japanese suicide where you've dishonored somebody or the family name or your own name or your master, and so you feel so despondent about that you take your own life in a ritualistic way, or in some ways you're also doing to make a point. I think Yukio Mishima did his suicide for that reason. But today, and there's been a real spike of young people committing suicide, and that's occurred in just the last few years. And in some ways, it's facilitated by the web and finding other people with similar problems that you can talk to. So, and unfortunately, in some cases, that is actually, well, I'm going to commit suicide, and here's how I'm going to do it. You want to come along with me? And so there's this idea of there's at least somebody else who's feeling the same way I am that will understand what I'm trying to go through. And I think that there's one anthropologist that I read who says that there's the absence of ikigai, or the worth of living, among suicide website visitors. And their view of suicide is a way of healing in some ways. So it's really kind of a complex issue, and it seems strange that most suicide victims that you hear about have always do it in privacy or by themselves. So this idea of group suicide is really something that's different, I think, and facilitated by the web. There's always been the traditional lover suicide too, of two people committing suicide because they couldn't express their love or be together. But so this is something new in Japan, and I don't really know if anybody has a really good handle on exactly why it is occurring or the type of psychology that it's demonstrating. So, and I think it's fairly new, so it's hard to, maybe there hasn't been enough research done on it. But for me, as far as Monono ware tie-in, I think that it's almost the ultimate poetic act in some way of doing it and really coming to grip with your emotions and wanting to express it. And that's kind of the idea of Monono ware. And so that's why it is tied into the story fairly tightly.
And in the book, in the story, there is the reader gets a kind of slow reveal of information about what Monono ware is or might be, and they get a kind of a slow reveal about Zach coming to grips with it, and of course about the background of his grandfather. And I think to your other books as well, 365 Views and The Fourth Treasure, both of them. And in 365 Views, the reader is slowly revealed just what's going on with this kind of eccentric family of artists/geniuses. And in The Fourth Treasure, it's slowly revealed what the interconnections are between all these characters in modern day Berkeley and in 70s Japan. And for all the experimentalism you can find in your books, it does seem to me there's also a love for, well, I guess what you'd find in a classic mystery novel, in the way that information is released to the reader to get them to keep the satisfaction of reading at a high at all times. And you have a theory of satisfaction laid out on your blog about this, but is this something at the forefront of your mind when you're writing, to sort of find the optimal way to give the reader details and to sort of keep them always on the edge in that sense?
Yeah, you're right. It is quite I think, more of a traditional mystery kind of story arc, and I think that comes from I really like hard-boiled detective mysteries. It's kind of my guilty pleasure for reading, I guess. Well, it doesn't have to be guilty, but it's a pleasure. So, and I think that's the way those stories are plotted. So I would definitely say that I've really picked up on that in my own plotting. And yeah, it's more of a classical kind of approach, and I think postmodernism does that well. Though I think that you can take different genres and make it your own in different ways. So it's not a straightforward mystery, but it uses mystery plotting. So in that sense, I think it's somewhat post-modernish. Post-modernish means kind of a pastiche of styles, kind of thrown together, and hopefully it all works kind of way. So I do like a straightforward story every now and then, reading, my own reading, but I also like real experimental works too, just to see, how different writers can do different things and see, if it works and what doesn't work. So So I'm kind of a blend of the two. I guess you would say. Yeah, I would say more of a. I can really do a kind of a straightforward plotting, mystery kind of plotting, as well as the experimental vein. So I'm still trying to figure all that out. So I don't know I don't know exactly how all that's going to come out or if it works, but it's kind of both conscious and subconscious, I think.
Some of the writers I, for example, have on the show I talk to, they'll say things about how it's too late to write a straightforward, say, mystery novel because the form's been done too much. There's nothing left in the well. But then I do think of books like yours that can use as much genre stuff as they want, it seems to me, because they balance it out by doing new things formally, like we've talked about your books doing, or they balance it out by using those genre elements to explore things that, no Raymond Chandler book ever explored Monono ware that I know of. Is that something you might agree with, that it's made more possible to use all these literary techniques that are kind of time-worn? You can use them as much as you want if you find a new way of putting them all together, if that makes any sense whatsoever?
Oh, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think I write for me as well as for readers, so I write something that I feel is something that really is me. And when I first started out writing, I tried, many years ago, I tried writing more traditional genre. I think I started out with, Stephen King was real popular, so I started out writing a horror. And then let's see. So then there was this kind of satirical story that became popular. So I kind of tried to write that, and I probably wrote 5 or 6 novels. Trying to fit into a genre, finding something that I was really good at, and nothing was really working. And then I wrote 300. And then I said, well, I'm just going to write what I want to write, and the way I feel, and see how it goes. And that's when I wrote 365 Views of Mount Fuji, which. I found a publisher, and it's obviously not any. Really, it'd be hard to define the genre for that. So I decided that it's really up to me as an artist, as a writer, to find my own way and use what I like, and use things that I think are interesting and unique and different that I find interesting and unique to me. So and just go that route. And I think that's more of an honest approach. I think other writers figured that out a lot earlier than I did, so I could be a lot farther along if I figured that out right away. But I got all the bad books out of my system right away, so at least now I can focus on something a little more that's me and good, I hope.
Now, we discussed the fact that your books all include art by your wife, and this one is the most lavish, I would say, art. It's got an edition out from Chin Music Press that integrates it very well, and it uses different kinds of paper and full color and et cetera, so on and so forth. Now, how did your books become so inseparable from this art? It seems like, first of all, I'll ask this: it doesn't seem to me that you would go back to writing books that were just text, would you? There's always going to be some art component, right?
I like the visual feel of a book, and there's no reason why not to have a visual appeal to it. And it helps me to have Linda, my wife, work on a project with me. We never really sit down and say, "Oh, here's chapter 1. It's about this. Could you illustrate it this way?" It's never that way at all. It's more about, here's my story idea. I give her kind of the basic outline and the fundamental plot, and maybe but that's usually about it. And then she says, "Oh, I want to explore that today in an artistic format." And so she goes off and does her thing, and I do my thing. And so it's never an illustrated book. It's more of it's more complemented by the art. And so so that works really well for us. Plus, it helps me to have someone to talk about it with, in a non-writing sense. I can talk to her about the general ideas, and she has a totally different approach to how she, wants to express that idea. And that really helps me, I think, become more creative, because I kind of have to keep up with her as far as creativity goes, because she's really, really outstanding creative artist. So I have to be just as good. So I think that for several reasons, I think we'll always work together on projects. And now if you're just going to write text, I think that it's kind of going towards more of, the digital format. There's not going to be maybe not as many printed books in the future. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but I think when we do a book, at least for us, we want to really focus on coming up with a really beautiful visual thing that people will treasure as much as the story, but it also is an object in itself.
And with my eyes on the publishing industry, as I've kept them interviewing authors about books, it does seem to me, and especially seeing books like seeing what publishers like Chin Music do, it seems to me that the industry for printed books, it kind of belongs or will belong to these publishers who want to make the richest books or the most physical book medium using books as possible, because of course if something is just text, it is a better product on an e-reader, but would not be a better product on an e-reader because you couldn't do most of what's going on here visually on that. And now, first of all, I'll ask, is that something you find plausible, that this is, I mean, from what you've just answered, of course, it does seem like you believe that things are going that way as well, but is that also the way you want to read books? If you just pick up a book, you would rather yourself have had a book that integrated art and that was more of a feedback loop between text and art than not, right?
Oh yeah, I definitely like those kind of books, and it's good because Linda and I can share that experience in different ways. I'm looking at the book from an artistic point of view as well as a story text point of view, so it's more interesting for me to see how all that works, and mainly because that's what I like to see, and that's what I like to do. So the more books like that, that I can find, I collect a lot of them. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in, and I think there are definitely a lot of really hardcore book collector type people that also like the attention to detail with the book, the typography and the pages and the actual feel of the book itself. And I know when people first pick up they kind of say yeah, literally it's so substantial. It feels like a book. And they flip through it and the pages, they kind of run their fingertips across the pages and they say, this feels great. I like this so much. Just the feel and the look of it, and I know that's important to us. That if we're going to spend money on printing a book, geez, it's so expensive that. And getting more expensive. You really want that experience to be as pleasurable as possible.
There's another project I wanted to make sure to ask you about. It's one that readers can call up your website and they can read details about it on your upcoming projects page. But we mentioned Kobo Abe. We mentioned his influence on you and how he's a favorite novelist of both of ours. And you have a project there, Why Ghosts Appear, which is a sequel there to The Ruined Map, a particularly good hard-boiled style detective novel from Kobo Abe. How did you decide you would need to write a sequel to this book?
The Ruined Map's the only novel I've read at least 5 times. It's just utterly captivates me, and I really don't know what happens. Every time I read it, there's a different experience. It could be because of my life is different at the time, or I've read something different in a different way, and very few novels can do that.
Now, first of all, I should say, not to cut you off, but since you're such an enthusiast of the book, there's going to be a lot of people listening who haven't read any Kobo Abe and haven't read The Ruined Map. So, as someone who's read The Ruined Map 5 times, how would you describe it to the listener?
Well, it's a deeply complex psychological study of a woman seen through the eyes of a private detective whose husband goes missing. And the more he digs into the life of the wife as well as and the husband who is missing, the deeper he gets into the psychology of this kind of underbelly of Japan, and he keeps slipping. It's like the first scene is his car kind of slipping up the slope, and the whole book is his just kind of slipping, trying to go up a hill and slipping down, or going down and slipping and going off the road, and it's just this wildly difficult to grasp what's going on, but you kind of just forget about it and go along for the ride and see what's going to happen. It's got elements of surrealism that Kobo Abe does, but it's probably less surrealistic than his other books, so it's a little bit more realistically written. But in the way it keeps going down and down and down, and it's really difficult to say what is happening a lot of the times, but I find that you don't really need to necessarily understand what's going on, but there is this idea for me that's kind of I wanted some closure to this damn book that's really frustrated me, as well as I found such enjoyment out of. So I decided, well, what happens to this detective? And he's nameless. He's in the book. He's nameless. And what happens to this nameless detective with his life? And so I just started imagining all sorts of things. And when I was living in Japan, I in the 80s, so this is about 20 years after the ruined map takes place. And so I was wondering, what would he be doing today? You know, what would his life be like? So eventually I put together a new case for him that also kind of harkens back to the case in the ruined map, and they kind of play off of each other through the sequel that I wrote. So it's really an homage to him, as well as my own frustration in trying to what really happened with this woman. Yeah, what happened? So I came up with an additional storyline and interplayed the two, and it was actually the funnest project I've ever written in my life. I just loved every minute of it. So. But Kobo Abe, if you haven't ever read Kobo Abe, some of his work can be just way out there, and some of it can be so gripping, realistic, and there's kind of an interplay between the two. But I think this one is really closely follows his style in the ruined map.
Now, first approaching Kobo Abe's body of work and the ruined map itself and his sensibility, the world that he creates, because it does seem like he has a world of his own in his books, coming at this as your source material and as your canvas and as the realm you would be working in. I mean, is this like coming onto a treasure trove to kind of do what you want with, or is this forbidding, like you've got to handle with care because this is the legacy of your favorite author you're working with?
Well, more of the treasure trove, because I really find it just so freeing, creatively freeing, and so it really works. His stuff always works for me in some way. Sometimes it's a little grating, but it still works in a story sense. I find it just really a great treasure trove of creative kind of ideas and how to write. But there is the idea of, there's, in Japan, he would be the master and I would kind of be his apprentice. And so there's a kind of that idea, too, of kind of more of the hierarchical, rigid structure of how to interact with. So if he was alive and I tried to, say I'm going to write a sequel, I'm sure that he would probably nix that idea. I would find it difficult to approach him even to say, I would really like to write the sequel. But he's not here anymore, so I feel a little bit freer in approaching that. I think that both, but mostly this freedom of the way he writes is really ties into the way I write as well. So it's been a good experience for me to really get into his writing style through writing the sequel.
The new book, once again, is A Mystery of Monono. Todd Shimoda, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
It's been my pleasure.
If you'd like to find out more about Todd or Linda Shimoda or their previous books, visit shimodaworks.com. This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Find out about me or this show at colinmarshallradio.com. That is where the official Marketplace of Ideas show archive is as well. Listen to all the old ones or this one again. Ben Althouse is the man who makes our theme music. Find him online at benalthouse.com. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.